The rain had been falling since late afternoon, steady and soft at first, like a shy visitor tapping at the windows. By evening, it had deepened into a rhythmic drumming, steady as a heartbeat, filling the little stone cottage with a sound both soothing and isolating. Outside, the world blurred, trees melted into shadowy shapes, their branches sagging under the weight of water. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp wood and the faint trace of lavender from the fire-warmed blankets. Isabelle sat curled in her chair, a book resting half open on her lap, though she hadn't turned a page in over 20 minutes. She wasn't reading anymore. She was listening. Listening to the rain, yes, but also to the way it seemed to carry whispers. She had always loved storms. They gave her an excuse to stay indoors without guilt, to light the hearth and brew tea, to lose herself in worlds made of words. But tonight felt different. There was a heaviness to the weather, as if the clouds were not simply spilling rain but pressing the sky downward. A low fog clung to the hills, and the forest beyond the cottage looked impossibly dark, its outlines shifting like something alive. Isabelle caught herself glancing toward the window more often than usual, each time expecting to see. What, exactly? She couldn't say. The feeling was neither fear nor excitement, but a strange mixture of both. Like being on the brink of a story you haven't yet been told. The kettle whistled sharply, startling her into motion. She poured the steaming water over dried chamomile blossoms, watching the pale gold tendrils curl upward, scenting the air with something calming and floral. But even as she breathed it in, she couldn't shake the pull of the outside world. She moved to the window and pressed her fingertips to the cold glass. Beyond the rain-slicked panes, the path leading into the forest glistened faintly under the scattered light of the oil lamp. She imagined footsteps there, splashing softly in the puddles, an image so vivid that her chest tightened, though no one was in sight. When the knock came, it was almost too gentle to hear over the storm. A single tap, then another, then silence. Isabelle froze, her breath caught somewhere between her throat and her lungs. In her years living here, visitors were rare, and unannounced visitors at night were unheard of. She set her cup down and approached the door slowly, feeling the old wooden boards shift slightly beneath her weight. Another knock, firmer this time. She hesitated, then drew back the latch and opened the door just a crack. A man stood there, though man seemed too simple a word for what she saw. His shoulders filled the doorway, his cloak dripping rain onto the threshold, and his eyes, deep, amber, and unblinking, held hers with a strange intensity. His features were striking, almost beautiful, but edged with something wild, untamed. Behind him, the forest swayed, and for an instant, Isabelle thought she saw something else moving in the shadows beyond, something large and hulking, a shape that vanished the moment she blinked. Isabelle hesitated only a heartbeat before stepping back, enough to let the man enter. The rain followed him in, a rush of cold air carrying the scent of wet earth and pine. His boots thudded against the wooden floor, leaving dark, glistening prints behind. He did not remove his hood right away, but the lamplight caught in his eyes again, those amber depths that seemed to hold their own light, as though the fire's reflection had found a home there. Isabelle shut the door against the wind, and for a moment, they simply stood in the quiet, save for the muffled roar of rain outside. "You're far from the village," she said at last, her voice quieter than she intended. It wasn't just curiosity, it was a kind of unspoken question. "Why are you here?" His gaze didn't waver. "I'm looking for shelter," he replied, his voice deep, almost velvety, yet carrying a strange roughness, as though unused to speaking. Something in the way he said it made it sound less like a request and more like a statement of fact, as though his being here was inevitable. She gestured toward the chair opposite hers, near the fire. He moved toward it with a grace that seemed unexpected for someone his size, removing his cloak at last. Beneath it, his clothing was plain but well-worn. Dark wool trousers, a shirt laced at the neck, a leather vest that looked older than he was. His hair, nearly black and thick, clung damply to his temples. Isabelle noticed the faintest trace of something unusual in his features, too sharp in some places, too softened in others, like a face caught between two forms. She told herself she was imagining it. She poured him tea, though he didn't seem to be the kind of man accustomed to such a gentle offering. He took the cup but didn't drink immediately, instead warming his hands against the steam. She watched the way his eyes drifted toward the window, as though tracking something moving outside. When she followed his gaze, there was only the blurred darkness of the forest, the rain falling in endless silver threads. But a faint unease stirred in her, as if something out there was aware of them both. The fire cracked, a log collapsing into a bed of glowing embers. The man's attention shifted back to her. "You live here alone?" The question was simple, but it carried a weight that made her pulse quicken. She nodded slowly. He said nothing more for a while, and in that silence, Isabelle realized she could hear the rain again. But layered beneath it was another sound, low and distant. It was not thunder. It was deeper, almost like a growl, carried faintly through the trees. The sound beneath the rain lingered in Isabelle's mind long after it faded. She tried to tell herself it was nothing, a trick of the storm, perhaps a fallen tree groaning in the wind. But the stranger's stillness made her doubt that. He hadn't touched his tea. Instead, he sat with his hands wrapped loosely around the cup, gaze fixed somewhere far away, as though his mind was walking deep into the forest without him. The firelight carved sharp planes into his face, throwing half of it into shadow, and for the first time, Isabelle noticed something almost predatory in the set of his jaw. "You're listening for it," she said before she could stop herself. His amber eyes flicked to hers. A pause, then, "You heard it too." His voice was low, but there was no surprise in it. The words landed with the weight of confirmation, as if he'd been waiting for her to admit it. She opened her mouth to ask what it was, but he shook his head slightly, not in denial, but in warning. Outside, the rain shifted, becoming heavier, the drops striking the roof in erratic bursts, as though the storm itself had grown restless. The lamplight near the window flickered, and a brief gust rattled the panes. Isabelle rose and checked the latch. The glass was cold under her fingertips, the outside world beyond it even darker than before. In the near distance, she thought she saw it again, a hulking silhouette, low to the ground but impossibly broad. This time, it didn't move away. Instead, it seemed to pivot slowly toward the cottage, its outline blurred by the curtain of rain. She stepped back, her breath quickening. "There's something out there," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she meant to tell him or herself. He didn't come to the window, didn't even turn his head. "I know," he said simply, and set the untouched tea on the table. Something in his voice told her that whatever waited outside wasn't merely passing through. It was here for a reason. And somehow, that reason was tied to him. The fire dimmed for a moment as the wind howled down the chimney. The man finally rose, moving with the same quiet grace as before, and retrieved his cloak. "You should keep the door locked tonight," he said. She didn't like the way he phrased it. "Not we, but you." And as he fastened the cloak around his shoulders, she had the unsettling sense that he might leave as suddenly as he arrived, or worse, that he might not leave alone. The rain was no longer simply falling. It was slanting in sheets, driven by a wind that roared down from the hills. Every gust seemed to scrape its fingers across the cottage roof, shaking the beams above Isabelle's head. The fire hissed as stray droplets slipped down the chimney, a reminder that even here, in her small circle of warmth, the storm had a way of intruding. She wrapped her shawl tighter, her eyes never straying far from the man as he stood by the door, fastening the last clasp of his cloak. "You're leaving?" she asked, surprised at the way her voice carried, sharper than she'd intended. He paused, but didn't turn toward her right away. "If I stay," he said slowly, "it might find you." The words were strange, heavy with meaning she couldn't unravel. She moved closer, feeling a swell of stubbornness rise in her chest. "If you leave, it still might." That earned her a glance, brief but sharp, as though she'd said something dangerous without knowing why. Outside, something shifted. It wasn't the wind. She knew the sounds of the forest well enough to tell the difference. This was heavier, deliberate. A crunch of wet leaves. Then another. The steps were slow but steady, each one closing the distance between the shadow she'd seen and the walls of her home. The man's hand moved instinctively to the clasp of his cloak, loosening it again. It was the smallest motion, but it felt like watching a soldier preparing for a fight. The next sound was closer still, too close. Isabelle's breath caught as she turned toward the window, but the rain distorted everything beyond it, turning the shape into a shifting smear of darkness. For a moment, She thought she saw the glint of eyes, low, golden, and unblinking. The stranger stepped in front of her, blocking her view. "Don't look at it," he said, his tone low and edged with something almost like command. She felt the absurd urge to push past him and see anyway, but some instinct deep inside her obeyed. For a long moment, there was only the hammering of the rain. Then, faintly, a sound that made her skin crawl, a deep, rumbling growl, not of hunger but of warning, as if whatever was outside was telling the man something only he could understand. His jaw tightened. "It's closer than the trees now," he murmured, almost to himself. And though the words made no sense, Isabelle knew with chilling certainty that they were not meant as a metaphor. The knock wasn't a knock at all. It was a jolt against the doorframe, deep and resonant, the kind of sound that came from weight, not from a polite hand asking entry. Isabelle froze mid-step, her breath snagging in her chest. The stranger moved before she could think, striding to the door and pressing his palm flat against the wood as though holding it shut. His head tilted slightly, listening, his body poised but not tense, like a man who knew exactly what waited on the other side. Something scraped along the lower edge of the door, a slow, dragging sound, as if claws tested the boundary between outside and in. Isabelle's skin prickled. She backed toward the hearth, but her eyes stayed locked on the man's broad shoulders. He didn't flinch, didn't look at her, only said in that deep, roughened voice, "It won't leave while I'm here." The words should have reassured her, but they didn't. Instead, they made her wonder, was it because he could protect her, or because it was here for him? The growl came next, low and rolling, so deep she felt it more in her bones than in her ears. The stranger answered it, not with words but with a sound of his own, a low, guttural tone that made the fine hairs on her arms stand on end. It wasn't human. It wasn't entirely animal either. And yet, there was an understanding between the two sounds, a conversation of warning and recognition. Isabelle gripped the edge of the table, her heart pounding, realizing she was witnessing something not meant for human ears. The thing outside struck again. This time the doorframe shuddered, the old hinges groaning in protest. Isabelle gasped and took a step forward. "We can't just," she began, but he cut her off without turning. "Stay back." His voice was steel now, each word deliberate. She hated the instinct that made her obey. Outside, the creature let out another rumble, longer this time, the sound bending into something almost like frustration. Then came silence, a heavy, waiting silence. When he finally stepped away from the door, the stranger's expression was unreadable, but there was a sheen of rain on his hair, though he hadn't opened the door. "It's gone," he said, though she didn't believe it, not fully. The air in the cottage felt charged, the way it does just before lightning splits the sky. She realized then that this wasn't over. Whatever stood outside hadn't left, it had retreated. And if it came back, she wasn't sure whether she feared the creature more or the man who seemed to speak its language. The storm broke just before dawn, leaving the air sharp and wet, the kind of clean that only comes after a night of hard rain. Isabelle hadn't slept. She sat by the dying fire, its last embers glowing faintly, watching the stranger move about the cottage as though he belonged there. He hadn't left after declaring the creature gone. Instead, he'd hung his cloak to dry, added wood to the hearth, and poured himself the tea he'd ignored hours before. There was a stillness to him now, but not the peaceful kind. It was the stillness of someone waiting. When the light began to seep in through the windows, Isabelle stood and crossed to the door. Outside, the world was silvered with mist. The trees dripped steadily, their branches heavy with water. Puddles shone like glass across the path. She stepped out onto the threshold and looked toward the forest. The rain had erased all but the freshest marks in the mud, and there they were, prints. They weren't human. Each one was broader than her hand, pressed deep enough to suggest immense weight, and they circled the cottage in an uneven arc. She swallowed hard. The stranger appeared behind her without a sound. "Don't follow them," he said, his voice low, almost gentle this time. She turned, meeting his gaze. "You knew it would come," she said. "You knew it wouldn't just wander by." He didn't answer. For a moment, the mist swirled between them, the air smelling faintly of pine and something else, something wild. She felt as if she were standing on the edge of a story that had started long before she entered it. They went back inside. Isabelle tried to busy herself, boiling water, stacking logs, anything to keep her hands moving. But the cottage felt different now. It wasn't just the lingering damp or the way her thoughts kept replaying the growls in the night. It was him. He was too large for the space, his presence pressing against the walls as surely as the storm had. And yet, she wasn't sure she wanted him gone. That thought unsettled her more than the prince outside by mid-morning. The mist had thickened again, swallowing the trees until the forest was no more than a wall of pale gray. The stranger sat by the window, one hand resting loosely on the table, his eyes fixed on the shifting fog. "It won't be the last time," he said, as if speaking to himself. She realized then that whatever tether bound him to the thing in the woods was not broken. And if he stayed, the creature would come back. That should have frightened her more than it did. The mist didn't lift all day. It pressed against the windows like another wall, muffling sound and turning the forest into a shapeless void. Isabelle spent the morning in small, unnecessary tasks, polishing the kettle, refolding blankets, sweeping the already clean floor, while the stranger remained by the window, his gaze on the pale blur beyond. The quiet was almost a relief after the storm, but it had weight to it, the kind that makes you notice every movement, every breath. By afternoon, the fire had grown low, and she went to fetch more wood from the stack outside. When she returned, he had moved from the window to the hearth, crouched low to feed the flames. The sleeves of his shirt were rolled past his elbows, revealing forearms corded with strength but dusted faintly with scars, marks that didn't look like the work of blade or accident. She paused, half hidden in the doorway, wondering what stories those scars carried and whether he would ever tell them. "You watch too much," he said without looking up, his voice quiet but not unkind. She flushed, setting the wood down with more noise than necessary. "You don't speak enough," she countered. That earned her the smallest curve of his mouth. Almost a smile, though it disappeared as quickly as it came. "Words don't change what's outside," he replied, placing another log on the fire. "Or what's coming." She wondered then if he lived his whole life in expectation of something. Something like the creature in the forest. They shared a meal in near silence. The only sounds the crackle of the fire and the occasional faint creak of the cottage settling. At one point, his hand brushed hers as he passed her the bread, and it startled her, not because it was sudden, but because it wasn't cold the way she expected. His touch was warm, grounding. She didn't pull away immediately. He noticed. That night, she lay awake in her small bed, the mist still pressed against the glass. Somewhere in the cottage, he was awake too. She could feel it. The awareness of him there was as steady and constant as her own breath. Outside, the forest made no sound at all, but she knew it wasn't sleeping. Neither was he. Neither was she. It began with the change in the air. Isabelle had been half dozing in her chair by the fire, the book in her lap unread, when she felt it, the subtle drop in warmth, the way the quiet became too quiet. Even the mist outside seemed to still, as if holding its breath. Across the room, the stranger stiffened without looking up from the knife he was honing. He set it down, the sound of metal on wood unnaturally loud in the hush. She rose and crossed to the window, peering into the pale wall beyond the glass. For a moment, there was nothing, just the vague shapes of dripping branches. Then, from the shifting white, two golden points emerged. They were not large, but they were unblinking, steady, and fixed directly on her. She froze, her fingers curling against the windowsill. The distance between them couldn't have been more than a dozen paces, and yet there was no outline to the body behind those eyes. Only the mist. The stranger was beside her in 2 strides, his presence like a wall at her back. "Step away," he murmured, his voice lower than she'd ever heard it. She didn't move. "It's not coming closer," she whispered. But even as she said it, she wasn't sure that was true. The eyes held her in place, not with threat, but with something more unsettling, curiosity. She had the strange and terrible thought that it wasn't here for him alone anymore. When he put his hand on her shoulder, it was firm, almost urgent, and it broke the pull long enough for her to step back. The golden points vanished into the mist with a slow blink, leaving nothing but the pale veil of fog. She turned to him, her breath unsteady. "It was watching me," she said, and his silence was answer enough. His jaw was tight, his gaze fixed on the door as though expecting it to open on its own. They barred the door that night, dragging the heavy wooden chest across it for good measure. But as Isabelle lay awake in the dark, she could still see those eyes in her mind, steady, unblinking, and far too intelligent. She wasn't sure which unsettled her more, that the creature had looked at her like a puzzle or like a mirror. The night came in heavy and moonless, the mist clinging close to the ground like it didn't want to let go. Isabelle had tried to read, tried to keep her mind on the soft crackle of the fire, but every sound outside seemed magnified. The groan of wet branches, the slow patter of water dripping from the eaves. The stranger sat opposite her, sharpening his knife again, the steady rasp of steel on stone a rhythm she could almost lean into. Until it stopped, she looked up and saw him staring at the door. Not listening, staring. His posture was different now, coiled, every sense turned outward. Isabelle felt it too, the subtle pressure in the air, like the moment before a match is struck. Then came the sound, a low, dragging scrape along the wood, higher this time, nearer the latch. She swallowed, glancing toward the window, but it was only pale with fog, no eyes shining back at her. The stranger rose silently, stepping toward the door, his hand hovering just above the handle. "Don't," she whispered, but he didn't look at her. He tilted his head slightly, listening to something she couldn't hear. The scrape came again, followed by a weighty thump, soft but deliberate. It was leaning on the door. The thought hit her hard. There was nothing but a few inches of wood between them. The next sound was worse, a deep, throaty breath, long enough to fog the seam of light at the door's edge. It wasn't wind. She could smell it now, an earthy, wild scent, tinged with something faintly metallic. The stranger's hand dropped from the handle. "It's not here to test me this time," he said, his voice almost a growl of its own. "It's here for you." Isabelle felt her stomach knot, but before she could answer, the door shuddered violently, the chest they'd pushed against it shifting half an inch with the force. The stranger moved in an instant, bracing the door with his shoulder. "Back," he said sharply, not looking at her. But instead of stepping away, Isabelle reached for the table where the oil lamp sat, her fingers closing around its warm glass. She didn't know what she meant to do with it, only that she would not let him face whatever was outside alone. Somewhere beyond the wood, the creature let out a low sound that was not a growl this time, but something far more dangerous, a calling. The chest slid another inch under the next impact, and Isabelle knew the door wouldn't hold. The stranger didn't seem to notice the strain. His focus was somewhere else entirely, beyond the wood and the storm of her own heartbeat. "If it gets inside," he said without turning, "stay behind me." The words were in order, but his voice had softened, as if he hated giving them. Isabelle tightened her grip on the lamp. "If it gets inside," she said, "we fight together." Another blow hit the door, this one higher, rattling the hinges. Then, silence. The stranger exhaled once, slow and deliberate. "It's not going to break in," he murmured. "It's waiting for me to open it." That should have been the moment to secure the latch tighter, to add weight against the frame, but instead, he stepped back. Isabelle's pulse spiked. "What are you doing?" she hissed. He turned to her then, and for the first time since he'd arrived, she saw something raw in his expression. Pain, yes, but also resignation. "It's not hunting me," he said quietly. "It is me, or what I was before." The words landed heavy, as though they'd been carried a long way. Outside, the creature shifted, the boards creaking under its weight. Isabelle felt her breath leave her. "You're telling me that thing," she began, but he cut her off, "is bound to me, and if I don't face it, it will take you instead." The moment broke as the latch gave a sharp metallic click, by itself. The door swung inward with a slow, aching groan, letting in a wash of cold mist and the heavy scent of wet fur. The creature filled the threshold, its massive frame hunched, golden eyes fixed not on him, but on her. She lifted the lamp, but the stranger stepped between them in a single, fluid motion. For a moment, man and beast simply stared at each other, their breath steaming in the chill air, the space between them electric with something unspoken. Then, he moved, not away, but forward, pressing his palm to the creature's broad, furred chest. "Go back," he said, his voice low and steady. The beast's growl rolled through the cottage like distant thunder, but it didn't advance. Instead, its gaze slid to Isabelle one last time before it turned, melting into the mist until only the sound of heavy steps remained. The door stood open, the night spilling in as he closed it gently, the room suddenly too quiet without the creature's presence. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then, with the firelight catching faintly in his amber eyes, he said, "It won't stop coming. But it won't touch you while I'm here." Isabelle felt the truth of it settle deep inside her. She didn't know if she wanted him to stay because of the danger or despite it. But when he set his cloak back on the chair instead of his shoulders, she knew he'd already made the choice for both of them.